Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Jan Machielsen about his book titled The Basque Witch Hunt, A Secret History, that takes us to the early 1600s in the Basque region. Are we going to call this France? Are we going to call this Spain? We're going to get into that because there were some particular things happening, concerns, accusations, judgments about witchcraft, about terror, with all sorts of tales of cannibalism, of vampirism, of demonic sex. Lots of things were going on. And for a long time, we've thought we've known the story of what's happened here. But as this book tells us, perhaps not. So, Jan, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to tell us about this Basque witch hunt.
Thank you so much, Miranda. I'm really delighted to be here.
Well, I'm very pleased to have you. Could you start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and tell us why you decided to write this book?
That's an excellent question. I am a historian of witchcraft. I've written about the topic extensively from multiple angles. My first book was a biography of a demonologist called Martin Del Rio, who wrote a very influential work of witchcraft theory around the same time as this Basque witch hunt. So I came across the main source for this witch hunt, which is another work of demonology then. And I was actually sort of rather interested in the story behind that book, what really happened, as it were, rather than what this elite Frenchman, Pierre de Lancre, his name is, what this elite Frenchman wrote about it. And that's sort of like how it started. I was curious. I started going to the archives, discovered that there was actually a lot more material about this witch hunt than people thought. People thought that Pierre de Lancre's book was the only source available for it. And then, in the archives, I discovered quite a lot of fresh material that actually sort of showed that his role in this witch hunt had been sort of rather overprivileged. And I was rather keen on getting to the voices of the accused, basically, and also the voices of the accusers, and not just sort of like Pierre de Lancre's voice, which quite often, I think, so far has drowned out the voice of other people in the history of this witch hunt.
Always fun when a project starts from, I'm finding things in the archives, let's keep digging. That's always a fun moment for a historian. But as you said, his voice is really quite strong in this particular instance. So before we start deconstructing it and bringing in the things you were able to find, can you tell us what the kind of traditional history, obviously until your book, has been of these Basque witch hunts, and help us understand why his voice has been the main part of it?
Pierre de Lancre was one of the two judges that was sent to a territory called the Pays de la Bourg, which is a Basque-speaking territory on France's border with Spain. It's on the Atlantic coast. The main town is Bayonne, which people might know. It's rather famous in history. And it's for 4 months in 1609, he has unlimited powers to prosecute witches. Then there's almost complete silence. There are no contemporary pamphlets. There's almost no discussion whatsoever about what happened. And then in 1612, Pierre de Lancre writes a book about his experiences. And it's through that book that we've really sort of like seen this witch hunt. So we've always seen this witch hunt through Pierre de Lancre's eyes. It's he obviously as a judge sort of like prosecuted these accused women and men and their trial records, but those, with one exception, all of those trial records have gone up in flames when the court building of the Bordeaux appeals court on which he served, went up in flames in the early 18th century. So it's through Pierre de Lancre's tableau, that's the name of the book, it's through Pierre de Lancre's tableau that we've always seen his witch hunt. And obviously, given that he is the author, he sort of rather presents himself as the hero of this story. And as a result, we've always sort of seen this book with him as the only one with agency. He's the big bad villain who's responsible for this witch hunt. And that actually removes quite a lot of questions from view. One obvious question is that, he was obviously called in. There must have been a witchcraft problem before he arrived. And, starting in the archives, you can sort of build up a picture that is much richer, that actually sort of like shows that he was one part of a much more complex event that also included many other human actors, but also in some strange way also included non-human actors. And by non-human actors, I don't mean the devil, but I mean in particular the border between France and Spain, which in some strange way, as I show in my book, really sort of like made this witch hunt almost an inevitability.
So it's actually that exact geographic aspect that I'd like you to tell us about first as we start to move away from just his version of events. The Basque region is such a key kind of actor in this, particularly because of how it's understood, or perhaps more importantly, not understood by outsiders in this period. So can you give us an overview of the region and help us understand why it wasn't particularly well understood by outsiders?
Sure, yeah. So the Basque Country, we mostly think of it as being in Spain, but there is a smaller section that is part of France. And as a result, Basques have always sort of been the first line of defense between France, between French and Spain. So it's worth thinking about the wider geopolitics here as well. Sort of like France and Spain were the two leading European powers in the late 16th, early 17th century, and they loved meddling in each other's affairs. So in the 1590s, during the French Wars of Religion, Spain was sort of actively sort of like undermining the position of Henry of Navarre, who became Henry IV, the king who supported his witchcraft commission. And on the French side, Henry took great delight in supporting the various sort of religious and ethnic minorities in Spain. So there's always been sort of this geopolitical rivalry that sort of like basically put these different parts of the Basque Country at, sort of like in tension with one another. And yet at the same time, the Basque Country was also a maritime country known for its cod fishing and for its whaling. So the Basques in the 16th and early 17th century traveled across the Atlantic to go cod fishing and whaling off the coast of Canada. And for that, there was actually a surprising amount of collaboration between French Basques and Spanish Basques. So you have this sort of like really sort of strange situation where different Basques are sort of like, collaborating, but are also at times of tension at war in some of the main villages and towns of on the French side get burned down by Spanish troops repeatedly in the 16th and 17th century. And then the other factor that makes the border then so powerful is the fact that because the Basques are placed at the border, it means that they can't be taken for granted. And it means that, the Pays de Labour, this territory where the witch hunt takes place, has really unusual sort of like powers. So the people there are exempt from paying most taxes. Both the noblemen who live there and the towns have all sorts of privileges, and it is these conflicts between the noblemen and the towns that sort of like are really really key, I think, in generating this witchcraft panic, because they don't get on, and yet the crown is really powerless to intervene because it needs everyone in this border region because it's strategically important. So in those circumstances, it sort of ought to make sense for Henry IV to agree to this petition from the Pays de Labour for a witchcraft commission, because it sort of makes sense to. It's difficult for the crown to refuse such petitions, but B, it also sort of the only way for the crown to really assert its authority in a place like this is by sending its own representatives, because that's the only way it can sort of like assert its will is by doing so in person. So you have this sort of really rather complex geopolitical system where the border sort of actually determines who has power in this territory, but the border is also in some sense the source for a lot of the conflict, because it creates conflict between France and Spain, but it also indirectly creates conflict within the French border country.
This is very helpful to understand. And we haven't even brought any individual people into this, and yet there's already tensions, as you said. The other one, though, I want to pick up on before we get too much into the people is you mentioned the fish hunting, that the fishing is being a key part of this. Can we talk about that? The reliance of the economy, the reliance of society on the sea. How much is that also sort of part of these foundational conditions for what later becomes witch hunts?
What is really striking, if you read the surviving witchcraft testimony, is sort of how much it is permeated with these stories about witches attacking ships and witches raising storms and that sort of thing. In witchcraft, the economic underpinnings of the Basque country, particularly the towns on the coast, which is basically the epicenter of the witch hunt, was this whaling and this cod fishing. And because they sailed all the way up to Newfoundland in Canada, these sailors would be away from home for months at a time. They would usually leave in the spring and then not come back until the late autumn, sometimes even only sort of midwinter in January, depending on the particular trade. So that suggests just how perilous that trade was, and how much could go wrong. And, there are also then sort of like stories of witches holding their witches' Sabbaths in Canada, sort of like flying on broomsticks or on goats all the way up to Canada to hold their Sabbaths there. You can sort of see how these fears are reflected in stories about sort of magical sea creatures, but also you can sort of see how these fears are sort of like reflected in these accusations that I already mentioned of witches sinking ships. At the same time, because all the men were away at sea, in at least Pierre de Lancre's imagination, that also sort of made the Basque country, or the Pays de Labour at least, about a feminine space, where a space where for most of the year you only had women and old men. And this was a space that, in Pierre de Lancre's imagination, was therefore open to abuse by the devil. The devil could seduce these women to become witches. The devil, Pierre de Lancre writes, sort of like was offered the children by their mothers, as if he was another father. So while the men were away, the devil became a sort of another father figure for the children of the Pays de Labour. And that is really significant, because another sort of like really strange aspects of this witch hunt is the extent to which children acted as accusers of witches.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about those children. I'm glad you flagged them now for listeners as a kind of a mention to hear more about as we go. But what else was sort of happening in this early 1600s? Now that we have this idea of the border and its tensions, the importance of the sea and the way that might be seen by outsiders in terms of sort of gender dynamics and risk, what is happening that makes the early 1600s kind of that moment where there then is, as you said, a request for a royal commission to come all the way out to the border to investigate witchcraft? What is happening that petition is sent out and is answered yes?
So here I would return to the sort of geopolitics. It's sort of this is a moment of real difficulty in the relationship between France and Spain, and the years leading up to the witch hunt is also a period when there are some Spanish incursions into France, and then sort of like retaliation by the French. So there's a lot of sheep stealing on both sides, for instance. There's a lot of tension surrounding the various islands on the river that divides France and Spain, because it's sort of rather contested as to who those islands belong to and who get to sort of like try and grow stuff on there. So the border is actually rather unsettled at this very moment, which is, I think, an important part of the reason why Henry IV agrees to the idea of this witchcraft commission. one of the two judges, Jean de Espagnier, he even gets sent to inspect the border, and that fact has always been used to excuse him. It's always been used to sort of say, well, there were two judges, but Jean de Espagnier, he went off and looked at the border while Pierre de Lancre was hunting all the witches. One of the sources that has survived, and that I found, was actually his report about his border inspection. And so we know that we know he was only away for a week out of those 4 months. So the two judges clearly work together. But it also then shows just how important that border is to this story, and how the tensions at that particular moment in time sort of like really sort of legitimated the witch hunt. So that's an important thing. The other thing to sort of say is that this witch hunt had been, or the witchcraft panic had been building up gradually. So the first evidence for witchcraft trial that I found dates back to 1603. So that's 6 years, prior to the arrival of the judges. There is actually a lot of sort of like evidence, financial evidence, surviving for earlier witchcraft trials. And, there's a limit to what we can do with that material. But one of the things that they show is sort of that the normal way in which French justice works, which meant taking these accused witches on appeal all the way to Bordeaux, and not only the witches, but then also the accusers, which were these groups of children. They all had to be escorted to Bordeaux, where they would be examined by, really rather grand panels of judges who all needed to be paid. So there are real cost implications to the normal running of French justice. And the main reason why the people of the Pays de la Bourre wanted a witchcraft commission was because it would cut out the possibility of appeal, and you would only have to pay for these two judges to come over, which was a lot cheaper than the normal way in which French justice worked. So those are the two factors here that I would really rather highlight. Sort of like it's the particular geopolitical tensions, and the realities of French justice are really important factors in getting to the point of getting a witchcraft commission.
And is that why the king said yes to the petition?
So we don't know why he said yes, because that's one of the many sort of things that didn't survive. But we know that at the same time as he said yes to this commission, he was also supporting a very assertive policy at the border in other instances. We also know that he sort of reconfirmed a lot of the privileges of these stands. So in the wider context of his actions, it makes a great deal of sense for him to support this idea of a witchcraft commission. And there is no evidence of there being any other type of witchcraft commission like this in French history. So I think it really points to the importance of this territory because of its geopolitical location.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense as such a foundational element to it. Turning then to the idea that the fact that this commission was approved, was asked for local reasons, it was approved for sort of geopolitical reasons. Who then were the investigators sent out? Who actually were they? They were, as you mentioned, elite men, but what else do we know about them? What kinds of ideas were they bringing with them, both in terms of law that we might think of today, but you also mentioned in the book that they had a bunch of other sort of ideas about science and naturalist things that they also saw as being part of what they were being sent to do?
Yes, exactly. So the other way that historians have traditionally tried to excuse Jean de Espagnier, the other judge, was to sort of say that, he wasn't really interested in witches. He was an early man of science. He was an alchemist. He wrote books about natural philosophy, so early science. He was interested in, discovering the philosopher's stone. And actually, I sort of want to argue that the precise opposite, that someone who is really interested in discovering the secrets of nature would also be really interested in discovering the secrets of witches. And actually, there's a contemporary German translation of Pierre de Lancre's tableau, and it's literally called The Marvelous Secrets of Witches. So you could really sort of see what the parallel is. So Pierre de Lancre and Jean d'Espagnac, they really come at this witch hunt from this sort of elite level. They're lawyers, but they're also, Bordeaux is a highly cultured place. The Pierre de Lancre's tableau is a highly stylized, very literate account. We have lots of Baroque metaphors. It's and it clearly sort of seems to want to take part in this sort of like wider elite discourse. And there is this sort of like really interesting sort of like tension there between the judges, these elite Frenchmen, and then the exotic Basque women who, in Pierre de Lancre's imagination are he likens arriving in the Basque country to arriving in the New World, basically. So like it's a real encounter of the other that sort of like that Pierre de Lancre experiences at this sort of like border of France, and I think both men sort of like are fascinated by that, and they're both keen to discover more about what happens. So, for instance, one of the things that they do is sort of like they go and investigate several of the sites where the witch's Sabbath is meant to have been held at night, and then they go and in one case they sort of like claim to have found sort of like the shape of the cooking pot had left behind the night before. They claim to have found the recipes for the various potions that the witches made. They asked some of the accused and some of the teenage accusers to reenact some of the dances that they did at the Sabbath. So their level of curiosity about what happened is calling it scientific, of course, requires some heavy quotation marks. But there is a shared curiosity there that I think is really important, and it's actually something that Espagnac and de Lancre shared. And there is every document I found, shows that they both signed every document. So the idea that it was just one man is sort of not credible. The two of them, worked together. When Pierre de Lancre, months before his death, when he made his final will and testament, he appointed Jean d'Espagnac as the executor of his will. So clearly, even in 1630, so 20 years after the witch hunt, the two men were still on speaking terms, as it were. So it's almost a scientific expedition, this witch hunt, and that's sort of another way I think how you could make sense of the tableau, the book that de Lancre wrote about it, because it's almost a way of sort of like revealing to the world the marvelous secrets of witches.
Yeah, that's definitely a very interesting and probably quite helpful perspective to have, as much as it doesn't sound like it makes sense to our modern ears. This is, of course, the beauty of going into archives and excavating what was happening then. I do want to talk more now about the fact that, as we've been you've mentioned a few times, that children and young people were so central to this. So now that we've sort of mapped out sort of what's happening in the various kind of big picture factors going into this, why were children and young people such a big part of this? Were they exercising any agency to be so much in the forefront? Were they being forced to be? What's going on here?
Well, this is another really difficult issue, and it's just like the point we just made about sort of how difficult it is to sort of get our heads around the sort of scientific nature of this witchcraft commission. Getting our heads around the agency of the children caught up in this witch hunt is really difficult, because it means really us getting out of our 21st century skins and trying to reimagine the world in the early 17th century. One thing to start off with, I would say, is that there have actually been quite a few witch hunts in the Basque country before. The reason why we haven't noticed most of them is because they are on the Spanish side. So from a French perspective, the witch hunt in the Pays de la Bourg is absolutely unique, because it's like the largest witch hunt, and it's the one that someone, a Bordeaux judge, wrote a very famous book on. But if you dig through the sort of shared Basque history in witch hunting, you come across quite a lot of similar witch hunts going back a century or more, and in quite a few of those, you end up finding children acting as accusers, quite often either because they claim to have a special skill that they are able to identify witches by staring them in the eye and then seeing some demonic mark in the eye, or so a demon sitting on their shoulder or something like that, or because they were taken to the witch's Sabbath against their will. And that's sort of like what happens. It's the last bit in particular. That's what happens in the witch hunt in the early 17th century. And this happens well before Pierre de Lancre arrives. So the evidence that I've cobbled together from that sort of period between 1603 to 1609 really sort of shows how there were already at that stage groups of witnesses, témoins in French, witnesses who were all children or teenagers who were taken to the Sabbath against their will, and who then accused people, witches, of taking them there. And there is one particularly traumatic or really sad story of a 17-year-old girl from the village of Urun who says that she sometimes was taken by other people, but sometimes she went on her own, according to her own free will, and Pierre de Lancre executes her as a witch, and that sort of really shows the way in which that boundary between being a witness and being a witch works. Witnesses were taken to the Sabbath against their will. Witches went there voluntarily, and according to the testimony of Pierre de Lancre, calls her an excellent witch, and sort of says it's so rare to have witches confess so freely. But because she didn't realize that she was a witch, she thought she was a witness. And then, according to Pierre de Lancre, sort of like she freely confessed until she found herself on the scaffold against, next to some of the people she accused. And it's only at that point that she recounted everything when it was too late. And that sort of illustrates just sort of like how important does teenage accusers played. But getting into the mindset of that, of those teenagers and what brought them to accuse other people of witchcraft, that is really difficult from the sources that we have. And, given that I've been criticizing other historians for, sort of jumping to conclusions and, particularly comforting conclusions about, this is all Pierre de Lancre's fault, I also don't want to indulge too much in speculation. So I think there will always be sort of question marks around the role of these children and how they sort of like came to be caught up in this nightmare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely a limit to what we can possibly know. I wonder if we can turn, though, to speaking about the extent to which there were people in these communities who were not asking for commissioners to come from the king. Obviously, there was a petition that got sent, so there's some amount of kind of local hope that something will happen. There's children coming forward either of their own free will or not, or some mixture of that we're probably never going to be able to determine. Were there people in these communities who were trying to oppose these commissions? And if so, were they able to do anything with this opposition?
That's an excellent question. I think there is a very simple narrative out there about witchcraft, where you could sort of almost imagine sort of like a village where lots of bad things happen, and then you blame one person, say an older woman, of being responsible for all of those bad things. You execute her, and then, it's an act of catharsis. It's obviously scapegoating, but it's also a sense of, okay, everything bad that's happened to us has now been explained and has been sort of like, taken revenge for, and we can happily move on evermore and live happily ever after. That isn't really how witch hunting usually works, because most people who are accused of witchcraft have relatives, and those relatives know full well, or they realize the implications for them for their own fates possibly, but they know that they are that their relative is not a witch. So a lot of the tensions in the Basque Country before the arrival of the Witchcraft Commission come from tensions between the families of people accused of witchcraft and the families of the children who accused them. And this leads to even to communal violence. So I would sort of like place a particular role on the behavior of the families of the accused in sort of like fighting these witchcraft accusations, and that's sort of also in some sense a really important lesson for us in general. I think that even after, historians have never really thought about what happens to the Pays de Labour, to the Basque Country after the Witchcraft Commission ends. It's almost as if this is Pierre de Lancre. He is our main source. He is also the main agent of all the villainy. So when he leaves, everything must be fine. But that's not really plausible, is it, when you think of it in the ways I've just outlined, sort of like, and the surviving evidence sort of shows that even after the commission leaves, there's still, plenty of fears of witches going around, but there's also, no doubt, also plenty of people who oppose, the lynching of witches, which certainly happened, and the tensions in the territory just got worse as a result of this Witchcraft Commission. They didn't get better. So in that sense, the Witchcraft Commission certainly failed.
This is such an interesting part of this history for me, the idea of looking at kind of what happened afterwards. As you said, that the commission did not make anything better. However, people, although there was continued opposition, there were also still people trying to kind of do something to solve the witch problem. The commissioners didn't work. What else did they try?
So the first thing that was sort of like the main thing, I suppose, that was tried was a more spiritual approach. And this is sort of like where I think the Spanish experience comes in, because that's the approach that the Spanish Inquisition ends up adopting after the witch hunt spreads from France into Spain. And that's the idea that, well, this problem is so big, there are so many witches, let's just hear their confessions, forgive their sins, and then all will be forgiven. And so on the French side, they built a convent, and on a quite interesting location. The convent is called Our Lady of the Peace, which is already quite interesting as to sort of like, what it's meant to do. The location is even more interesting because it's built on an island on the river between Saint-Jean-de-Luz, which is one of the main towns, where the witch hunt got started originally, and the town of Cibourg on the other side. And these two communities were perpetually sort of like at odds with one another. And these sort of like, these Franciscan friars put themselves right in the middle between these two communities. So that was one effort. The other effort was to send Jesuit missionaries to the territory. And we have in the archives in Rome, in the Jesuit archives in Rome, I discovered quite a few reports from these missionaries. And, it's all about them sort of like hearing the confessions of, self-accused witches. And that's really, and with the idea that they're then forgiven, as long as they promise not to do it again. And that part of the story goes on until 1616. So that at that point we're 7 years on from the supposed end of the witch hunt. So there is a very long aftermath, and the only reason why the Jesuit mission ended was because one of the Jesuits had enough. Maybe he became skeptical of the reality of witchcraft. It's impossible to sort of say, but he just leaves and just disappears from the record, and they can't find a replacement for him. So you can sort of get a sense as to sort of like the way in which this witch hunt is not actually just a 4-month commission conducted by Pierre de Lancre, but actually it's a long drawn-out story that sort of starts in 1603 and then sort of like actually continues all the way until the end of the 1610s.
Mm. One of the things that you also talk about in the book that's happening after the commission leaves, during these periods of the Jesuits, the priests, the island in the middle of the river, is that the fears about witchcraft are also changing, which makes sense given the timeline you've just laid out for us. You know, no one thinks of fear exactly the same way year after year after year, right? It shifts and morphs. Why was it changing in such a way that witchcraft was being associated particularly with foreignness? And how can we understand that change explaining to some extent, perhaps, the sort of particularly violent end of this witch hunt?
So I am the story in 1619 with the murder really of a Portuguese converso woman, so a woman of Jewish descent, in the town of Saint Jean de Luz, basically by a mob at the hands of a mob, and the parallels between what happens in 1609 and 1619 are really sort of striking. The things that are being reported about these conversos, that they're all secretly Jews and that they're all worshipping in secret, and that they're committing acts of various atrocities, including various sort of like blaspheming the Eucharist, which is an important part of what happened to Catalina Fernandez, this the woman I just mentioned. The parallels are really striking between these two cases, but it's, I think, part of a longer story of geopolitical tension where you have increasing travel between France and Spain, and first of all you have accused witches, fleeing France into Spain, causing a witch hunt panic there, and then the Spanish Inquisition gets really sort of like worried about them, sort of like in the way in which the border plays a role. Sorry, the border plays a role there too, in a really sort of like interesting way, because the Spanish Inquisition, some of the more radical officials are like, no, we have to act very strictly against witchcraft, because if we don't act forcibly against witches, then all the French witches will just come into Spain. And then there is at the same time sort of like the witch hunts sort of like causes fears about foreign witches in particular to sort of like to really sort of strengthen during the 1610s. But at the same time, 1609 is also the year when Spain decides to expel its Morisco population from Spain into France. They decide to expel them, and lots of the Moriscos, these are conversos, but from Islamic background, they then leave Spain through various directions, including through France. And it seems that conversos of Jewish backgrounds also travel at this point. So during the 1610s, there's a real community of conversos building up on the French side of the border, which the Inquisition on the Spanish side sort of like sort of examines, or watches, with really, really great anxieties. They even send a spy over, with the aim of infiltrating this community. The spy completely fails and sort of gets caught, and then sort of like, so you have these two sort of like parallel things happening. On the one hand, you have the witchcraft panic spiraling, but also getting fused with the sense of foreignness, the witches that are suspected are particularly foreign witches. And on the other hand, you actually have actual, quotation mark, foreigners move to the French side of the border. And these are these converso populations, particularly these people of Jewish backgrounds. And then in 1619, one of these women is accused, a woman belonging to this community is accused of wanting to steal the Eucharist. And the Eucharist plays a really important role in the witch hunt in 1609. In 1609, lots of witches testify that ever since they made a pact with the devil, they can't see the Eucharist anymore. They instead just see a black cloud whenever they go to church, and the priest holds up the Eucharist during Mass. They can just see a black cloud. But the Eucharist, the fact that the Eucharist has a very it has strange resonances of the witch hunt, but it also has strange resonances of anti-Semitism as well. It's sort of like, there's plenty of stories of both witches and Jews sort of mutilating the Eucharist, and then it being the body of Christ, it then sort of starting to bleed. So when she sort of like tries to make off with this Eucharist, and I think she literally she said that she wanted to have it later as a snack, and I sort of suspect that was really what she was going to do, but it really sort of sparked a riot, and ultimately it meant that she was basically dragged by a mob of sailors in particular, who sort of dragged her to the main square of Saint Jean de Luz and put her in a barrel, filled it with straw and tar, and then sort of put her on fire. And it's a really frightening and really sort of tragic end to this story. But I think that's the important place to sort of like end the witch hunt there. That this was not a story that sort of ends because Pierre de Lancre left and everyone was celebrating, or this is not a story where sort of like reason triumphs over superstition or whatever. It's a story where one set of fears about secret others ends up being replaced with the same set of fears but targeting a different group of others. So that's the sort of like what a tragic final chapter of the book.
Yeah, no, definitely a lot to think about, all the entanglements as you've described them there. But that is not going to be the tragic end to our conversation. I do, in fact, have a further question to ask you, Jan, if you'll let me. This book is obviously done. People can go read it. It's therefore off your desk. What might you have your eye on to work on next, even if it's not a book, even if it's not about witch trials? Anything you want to give us a sneak preview of?
So I have a few witchcraft ideas left that I want to work on, but to be honest, I want to work, hopefully understandably, given what I just told you, I want to work on something happier. So the next project I want to work on has to do with saints and saint making. And I want to focus on and explore, rather than looking at why people thought their neighbors were particularly bad and evil, I am interested in exploring the exact opposite, but also in some sense identical process as to why people thought their neighbors were particularly holy. And of course there's lots of overlap there too, because some saints like Joan of Arc famously sort of like were also suspected of witchcraft at other points in time. But it's sort of, and so there's a lot of sort of like shared DNA, I think, between these two different projects, but it's just mostly a happier subject. And working on this story for the better part of a decade, from time to time really did take a toll on me. It's not an easy story to tell. There's so many sort of like pitfalls that I tried to sort of avoid. I didn't want to overly speculate. I also did not want to overly sensationalize the story. And it's so I'm ready for something new, but also something happier. Let's put it that way. And I'm hoping that Saints will bring me that.
Well, I hope so too, and very curious to see how that goes. But of course, while you are investigating saints, listeners can read the book we've been discussing, titled The Basque Witch Hunt, A Secret History, published by Bloomsbury in 2024. Jan, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to tell us about your book.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.